The weapon that crushed Nazi Germany's air force was not designed in some secret government laboratory. It was not built by a team of Ivy League engineers. It was designed by a German, a self-taught immigrant who never attended university. A man who learned to build engines in a tiny workshop and dreamed of aircraft while serving as a mechanic in the Austro-Hungarian military. He created the plane that would destroy the Luftwaffe and break the back of his homeland's war machine. And he did it in 102 days. Edgar Schmued was born in Hornbach, Germany, on December 30th, 1899. His father Heinrich was Austrian, which gave young Edgar dual citizenship in a Europe that would soon tear itself apart. The family was not wealthy. There were no connections to aviation royalty, no famous uncles in the aircraft business. Just a boy in a small town near the French border with a fascination for anything mechanical. At the age of 8, Edgar saw his first airplane in flight. It was not much by modern standards, a fragile contraption of wood, canvas, and wire that wobbled through the sky like a drunken bird. But to that 8-year-old boy, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. In that moment, watching that primitive flying machine struggle against gravity, Edgar Schmued made a decision that would change the course of history. He would dedicate his life to aviation. There was just one problem. He had no money for university, no connections to any engineering firm, no pathway to the world of aircraft design. So Edgar did something that would define his entire career. He taught himself. While other boys played, Edgar read. He devoured every technical book he could find. He studied mathematics, physics, and the emerging science of aerodynamics. He taught himself to think in 3 dimensions, to visualize how air flows over surfaces, how forces balance against each other in flight. When he was old enough, he took an apprenticeship at a small engine factory. It was not glamorous work. The hours were long, the pay was poor, and the conditions were harsh. But Edgar did not care. He was learning. He was understanding how machines worked from the inside out. He designed several innovative engine components and even received patents for his ideas. This was not the work of a university graduate. This was the work of a hungry mind refusing to be limited by circumstance. When World War I erupted across Europe, Edgar enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian aviation troops. He was not a pilot. He was a mechanic. He spent the war maintaining aircraft for men who flew into battle. But this experience was invaluable. He saw firsthand what worked and what failed. He watched aircraft return from combat riddled with bullet holes. He studied the damage patterns. He learned what kept planes flying and what brought them crashing down. When the war ended in 1918, the German economy lay in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled the nation. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Unemployment soared. The aviation industry, once a source of national pride, was essentially banned. Germany was forbidden from developing military aircraft. For a young man who dreamed of designing planes, staying in Germany meant waiting for a future that might never come. So in 1925, Edgar Schmued did what millions of Germans did during that desperate decade. He left. His older and younger brothers had already emigrated to Brazil, where they worked as dentists in the German community of São Paulo. Edgar followed them, carrying his dreams across the Atlantic to a new continent. He was 25 years old. He had no formal degree. He had no reputation. He had nothing but his notebooks full of designs and a burning determination to build aircraft. In Brazil, his mechanical skills earned him a position with the General Aviation Company, the air branch of General Motors Corporation. It was not aircraft design, but it was a foot in the door. He worked hard. He impressed his superiors. He demonstrated again and again that his self-taught knowledge was equal to, or better than, many university-educated engineers. In 1931, his excellent work in Brazil earned him something extraordinarily rare: a visa to the United States. Immigration rules were brutally strict during the Great Depression. According to his personal records, very few people were admitted from his quota that year. Edgar Schmued was among them. He arrived in America with almost nothing except his skills and his dreams. He went straight to work for the Fokker Aircraft Corporation of America, a General Motors subsidiary based in New Jersey. For the first time in his life, Edgar Schmued was actually designing aircraft. He was no longer just maintaining them or dreaming about them. He was creating them. His colleagues quickly discovered that this quiet German immigrant had an almost supernatural ability to visualize complex aerodynamic problems. In 1935, General Motors reorganized its aviation holdings into a new company called North American Aviation. The headquarters moved from Maryland to Los Angeles, California. Edgar's wife, Louisa, was reluctant to relocate across the country, so Edgar briefly joined another company, Bellanca, in New York. But the pull of North American was too strong. While traveling to California to rejoin North American, tragedy struck. En Route 60, the Schmueds' car was involved in a devastating head-on collision. Louisa was killed. Edgar was seriously injured. He lay in a hospital bed, his wife dead, his body broken, his dreams seemingly shattered. Most men would have given up. Most men would have returned to whatever safety they could find. Edgar Schmued was not most men. After recovering from his injuries, he went to work for North American's president, a charismatic Texan named James H. Kindleberger, known to everyone as Dutch. Kindleberger hired Schmued in early 1936 as a preliminary design engineer. He quickly recognized that he had found something special in this quiet, intense German immigrant. Schmued was different. He did not just solve problems. He saw solutions that others could not imagine. Over the next few years, Schmued contributed to several projects. He designed the front turret for the XB-21 bomber. He created the NA-50, a single-engine fighter sold to Peru. He worked on the NA-62, which would become the famous B-25 Mitchell bomber. With each project, his reputation grew. But deep inside, Edgar Schmued was waiting. He was waiting for the question that would change everything. That question came in early 1940. Europe was on fire. Hitler's armies had conquered Poland. The Wehrmacht was preparing to sweep through France. Britain stood alone, desperately short of aircraft. The Royal Air Force was burning through Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than factories could build them. They needed more planes. They needed them now. The British Purchasing Commission came to America, checkbook in hand. They approached Curtiss Wright, whose P-40 Tomahawk was one of the few American fighters that met European standards. But the Curtiss factory was already running at full capacity, so the British turned to North American Aviation. Would they build P-40s under license? Dutch Kindleberger walked into Edgar Schmued's office with the proposal. He looked at his chief designer and asked a simple question. "Ed, do we want to build P-40s here?" Schmued had been waiting years for this moment. His answer came without hesitation. "Well, Dutch, do not let us build an obsolete airplane. Let us build a new one. We can design and build a better one." It was an audacious claim. North American had never built a single seat fighter. The P-40 was a proven design, already in production. Schmued was proposing to start from scratch while Britain was fighting for its survival. But Kindleberger trusted his designer. He went back to the British with an extraordinary counteroffer. North American would design and build a completely new fighter. It would be faster than the P-40. It would carry more fuel. It would be easier to manufacture, and the prototype would be ready in 120 days. The British were skeptical, but desperate. They agreed. The contract was signed in late May 1940. The clock started ticking. What happened next was one of the most remarkable feats in aviation history. Edgar Schmued did not sleep. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. His team of engineers followed his lead. They were not just designing an airplane. They were racing against time itself. The pressure was immense. Every day that passed was another day that Britain fought alone. Every week of delay meant more Spitfires shot down, more pilots killed, more cities bombed. The British Purchasing Commission sent representatives to monitor AIGSA progress. They watched, nervous and skeptical, as Schmued's team worked around the clock in the Los Angeles factory. Schmued had assembled a remarkable team. His head aerodynamicist was Edward Hawkey, a brilliant engineer who would refine the laminar flow wing calculations. Raymond Rice served as chief engineer. Larry Waite handled technical engineering. Together they formed a tight-knit group that communicated almost telepathically. There was no time for formal meetings and lengthy memoranda. Problems were solved at the drafting tables, decisions made in real time. Schmued made several bold decisions that seemed crazy at the time. First, he chose to use a revolutionary new wing design. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, had developed something called a laminar flow airfoil. The theory was that by carefully shaping the wing, you could delay the transition from smooth laminar airflow to turbulent airflow. This would dramatically reduce drag and increase speed and range. No production aircraft had ever used a laminar flow wing. The mathematics were still being refined. The manufacturing tolerances were incredibly demanding. A tiny imperfection in the wing surface could destroy the laminar flow effect entirely. Most engineers would have considered it too risky. Schmued considered it essential. Second, he designed the fuselage using a revolutionary technique called conic lofting. The body of the aircraft was mathematically calculated using conic sections, resulting in surfaces so smooth that they seemed to flow like water. Every rivet was flush with the surface. Every panel fit perfectly against its neighbor. The result was an airframe with almost no parasitic drag. Third, Schmued positioned the radiator in a unique location. Instead of mounting it in the nose or under the wings like most fighters, he placed it behind the cockpit in a carefully designed duct. This gave the aircraft a distinctive belly scoop. But it also did something remarkable. As cooling air passed through the radiator, it was heated and expanded. When it exited the duct, it provided a small amount of thrust. The plane's cooling system actually made it faster. The British had asked for a prototype in 120 days. North American delivered in 102. On September 9, 1940, the prototype NA-73X rolled out of the factory. It had no engine yet. Allison, the engine manufacturer, was running behind schedule, but the airframe was complete. 102 days from contract signing to a finished prototype. It was unprecedented. When the Allison V-1710 engine finally arrived, test pilot Vance Breese took the prototype into the sky on October 26, 1940. The flight lasted just 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes proved that Schmued's gamble had paid off. The aircraft handled beautifully. It was fast. It was stable. It was everything he had promised. The British named it the Mustang. It was a wild horse from the American West. It was perfect. There is a remarkable anecdote about the prototype. When asked in 1981 at the 40th anniversary celebration of the Mustang's first flight whether the airplane was really designed and built in 100 days, Schmued gave a revealing answer. The Mustang prototype was indeed built in 100 days, he said, but I had been designing it for 5 years. This was the truth behind the legend. Schmued had been sketching fighter designs in his spare time for years. He had been thinking about optimal wing shapes, radiator placements, fuselage profiles. When the opportunity finally came, he was ready. Those 102 days were not spent figuring out what to build. They were spent building what he had already figured out. The prototype was not perfect. It had no engine when it rolled out because Allison was behind schedule. It used some borrowed parts from the T-6 trainer. The landing gear borrowed components from other aircraft. But the fundamental design was sound. More than sound. It was revolutionary. But here is where the story takes a painful twist. The early Mustang had a fatal flaw, not in its design but in its engine. The Allison V-1710 was a magnificent piece of American engineering, but it lacked a crucial feature. It had only a single-stage supercharger. At low altitudes, where the air was thick and dense, the Mustang was spectacular. It was faster than any British or German fighter. But above 15,000 feet, where the real air battles were being fought, the engine began to choke. The thin air starved it of oxygen. Power fell away. The Mustang became sluggish, vulnerable, outclassed. The United States Army Air Corps initially rejected the Mustang. They saw it as an inferior aircraft, useful only for ground attack and reconnaissance. While Schmued's creation was sent to secondary roles, the Luftwaffe was slaughtering American bombers over Germany. In October 1943, on a single mission to Schweinfurt, 60 B-17 flying fortresses were shot down. Over 600 young Americans killed or captured in a single afternoon. The bomber generals had promised that their aircraft could defend themselves. They were wrong. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber was one of the great tragic misconceptions of the early war. American military planners believed that formations of heavy bombers bristling with defensive machine guns could fight their way through to any target. They studied the theories of air power advocates who claimed that strategic bombing would make traditional warfare obsolete. The bomber will always get through, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had declared in 1932. This belief shaped American air strategy. The reality was brutal. German fighters learned exactly how to attack the bomber formations. They used head-on passes, which minimized the time spent in the bombers' defensive fire arcs. They concentrated on aircraft that had fallen out of formation due to damage or mechanical problems. They attacked from above, from the sun, from every angle that maximized their advantage. The problem was range. American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt were excellent aircraft, but they simply could not fly far enough. They could escort the bombers partway into Germany, but then they had to turn back. The moment the fighters left, the German interceptors attacked. They waited just outside the fighter escort range like wolves stalking a wounded deer. The bombers were being massacred. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Young men were dying by the hundreds every week. The strategic bombing campaign, which was supposed to bring Germany to its knees, was on the verge of collapse. Something had to change. And that something was waiting in a British test hangar. Then, in April 1942, a British test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang at the Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit. He was impressed by its speed and range at low altitude. But he recognized the same problem everyone else had. Above 15,000 feet, the aircraft simply could not compete with German fighters. However, Harker had an idea that would change everything. What if you put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang? The Merlin was the engine that powered the Spitfire. It had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power at high altitudes. If you could marry the Mustang's superb airframe to the Merlin's high-altitude performance, you might have something extraordinary. Harker wrote a memo to his superiors. The memo went up the chain of command. Engineers at Rolls-Royce ran the calculations. The numbers were staggering. A Merlin-powered Mustang might be able to reach 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. That would make it the fastest fighter in the world. In the summer of 1942, the British began converting several Mustangs to Merlin engines. They called them Mustang X's. On October 13, 1942, the first Merlin Mustang took to the air. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The aircraft was nearly 100 miles per hour faster at high altitude than the Allison-powered version. It could climb almost twice as fast. It could fight where the real air war was being decided. Meanwhile, back in California, Edgar Schmued and his team were working on their own Merlin conversion. They received British Merlin engines and installed them in test aircraft. The American version, designated XP-51B, flew on November 30, 1942. Test pilot Bob Chilton reached 441 miles per hour at nearly 30,000 feet. The engineers knew they had something special. Here is where history turns on a single decision. The United States Army Air Forces, which had ignored the Mustang for years, suddenly became very interested. They ordered the new Merlin-powered Mustang into mass production. The Packard Motor Company began building Merlins under license in Detroit. North American converted their entire Inglewood, California factory to Mustang production. A second factory opened in Dallas, Texas. The scale of production was staggering. By 1945, North American was producing Mustangs at a rate that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Inglewood plant alone employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce to support the war effort. The B-25 Mitchell bomber production was moved to Kansas City to free up capacity. Every available resource was devoted to getting Mustangs to the front. The P-51D model became the definitive variant. It featured a revolutionary bubble canopy that gave pilots 360-degree visibility. Earlier models had used a framed canopy that left significant blind spots, especially to the rear. German fighters had learned to attack from angles where they could not be seen. The bubble canopy eliminated this vulnerability. The P-51D also carried 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns instead of the 4 guns on earlier models. Each gun could fire at a rate of over 700 rounds per minute. The combined firepower was devastating. The aircraft could carry 1,000 pounds of bombs on wing racks or 10 5-inch rockets for ground attack missions. Production numbers tell the story of the Mustang's importance. Over 15,000 P-51s were built during the war. More than 8,000 of these were the D model alone. At its peak, North American was delivering several hundred aircraft per month. This was industrial warfare at its most efficient, turning raw materials into war-winning weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. But Edgar Schmued was not done innovating. He added an 85-gallon fuel tank behind the pilot's seat. He designed wing fittings that could carry 2 108-gallon drop tanks. With these modifications, the Mustang could fly over 700 miles from its base, fight, and return. It was the first single-engine fighter in history that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The first Merlin Mustangs arrived in England in late 1943. The first long-range escort mission to Germany came in December. By early 1944, the slaughter had reversed. The Mustangs met the Luftwaffe over Germany and began systematically destroying it. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, which would become known as Big Week. For 7 days, over 1,000 bombers attacked German aircraft factories. But the real battle was in the sky. The Mustangs, freed from close escort duties, hunted German fighters wherever they could find them. They attacked aircraft on the ground. They ambushed them during takeoff and landing. They pursued them relentlessly across the Reich. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, not because they lacked aircraft. German factories actually increased production throughout 1944. They were dying because they could not replace their pilots. The Mustangs were killing experienced aviators faster than Germany could train new ones. Flight school hours were cut. Half-trained pilots were thrown into combat. They died in droves. On March 4, 1944, P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to Berlin for the first time. Single-engine fighters over the German capital. It was unprecedented. It was devastating. When Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, learned that American fighters were appearing over Berlin, he reportedly recognized that Germany had lost control of the air war. The exact words attributed to him have been disputed, but the meaning was clear. The arrival of long-range American fighters over the Reich signaled the beginning of the end. Consider the irony for a moment. The aircraft that destroyed the Luftwaffe was designed by a German. Not just any German, but a man who had served in the Austro-Hungarian military during the World War I. A man who had learned his craft in workshops near the French border. A man who had been driven from his homeland by the economic devastation of the previous war, and now his creation was systematically annihilating the air force of the nation that had driven him away. There is another dimension to the Mustang story that deserves recognition. Among the pilots who flew the P-51 were the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American pilots who had fought discrimination at every step of their careers. The 332nd Fighter Group flew Mustangs with distinctive red tail markings. They escorted bombers to targets deep in Germany, compiling an impressive combat record. While a wartime myth grew that they never lost a bomber to enemy fighters, historical research has shown that 27 bombers were lost under their escort during 7 missions. However, this was still significantly better than the average of 46 bombers lost by other 15th Air Force fighter groups. Their skill and courage helped break down the barriers of segregation in the military. The Mustang was colorblind. It performed the same whether the pilot was white or black, whether he came from privilege or poverty. What mattered was skill, courage, and determination. In this way, Schmued's aircraft represented the best of what America could be, even as the nation struggled with its own contradictions. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force flew Mustangs. The P-51 had become the primary American fighter in Europe. Pilots loved it. They called it the Cadillac of the sky. The bombers loved it even more. They called the Mustangs their little friends. The numbers tell the story. Before the Mustang escorts arrived, bomber loss rates sometimes exceeded 9% per mission. Afterwards, losses dropped to less than 1%. Crews who had faced near certain death now had a reasonable chance of completing their 25 missions and going home. The difference was Edgar Schmued's airplane. What was it like to fly the Mustang in combat? Pilots described it in almost romantic terms. The aircraft was responsive, predictable, and forgiving of small mistakes. Its controls were well harmonized, meaning that the stick forces required for different maneuvers felt natural and balanced. A pilot could fly for hours without becoming exhausted from wrestling with the aircraft. The cockpit was relatively spacious for a single-engine fighter. Visibility was excellent, especially in the D model with its bubble canopy. The instruments were well arranged and easy to read. The engine gauges were grouped logically. Pilots could scan their instruments quickly and return their attention to the sky around them. The Packard Merlin engine was remarkably smooth and reliable. Pilots spoke of the engine as if it were alive, a trusted partner in the dangerous business of aerial combat. The two-stage supercharger operated automatically, controlled by a barometric switch. As the aircraft climbed through approximately 17,000 feet, the supercharger would shift to high gear, and the manifold pressure would surge. The pilot felt the aircraft leap forward as if it had found a second wind. Combat tactics evolved with the aircraft. Early escort doctrine required fighters to stay close to the bombers, weaving above and around the formation. This was defensive and reactive. The Luftwaffe could choose when and where to engage. General Doolittle's new doctrine freed the Mustangs to become hunters rather than guards. The psychological effect on both sides was significant. American bomber crews, who had watched helplessly as their comrades were shot down, now saw their little friends diving into German formations, scattering the attackers. German pilots, who had enjoyed almost risk-free attacks on unescorted bombers, now faced deadly opponents who sought them out aggressively. World War II ended in 1945, but Edgar Schmued was not finished designing aircraft. He applied the same innovative thinking to the jet age. He led the design of the F-82 twin Mustang, a long-range escort fighter that joined two Mustang fuselages together. He was the chief designer of the F-86 Sabre, which would dominate the skies over Korea and become America's first swept-wing jet fighter. Along with chief engineer Raymond Rice, he initiated the design studies for what would become the F-100 Super Sabre, the first fighter capable of sustained supersonic flight in level conditions, though he left North American before that aircraft's first flight. In 1952, after 22 years at North American, Schmued moved to Northrop Corporation. There, he led the team that created the F-5 Tiger, a lightweight supersonic fighter that emphasized simplicity, safety, and low cost. The F-5 was so successful that it remained in service with more than 20 nations for over 50 years. He also developed the T-38 Talon, which became the primary advanced trainer for the United States Air Force and is still flying today. Throughout his career, Schmued maintained the same principles he had learned in that small engine factory. Keep it simple. Make it reliable. Design for manufacturing. Do not waste a single ounce of weight or a single dollar of cost. Any damned fool can criticize, he once said, but it takes a genius to design it in the first place. Edgar Schmued retired from Northrop in 1957, but he never truly stopped working. He consulted for the Department of Defense, he advised Allied governments, he even helped the film industry with aviation-related movies. He was still actively working just before his death from a heart condition on June 1, 1985. He was 85 years old. What makes Schmued's story so remarkable is not just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it. He had no university degree, he had no wealthy family, he had no connections in the aviation industry. He taught himself engineering from books. He learned about aircraft by maintaining them as a mechanic. He arrived in America as a penniless immigrant during the depths of the Great Depression. And yet this self-taught German created some of the most important aircraft in history. The P-51 Mustang alone is considered by many experts to be the finest propeller-driven fighter ever built. Over 15,000 were produced during the war. They destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft. They changed the course of the air war over Europe. They saved countless thousands of Allied lives. Think about what would have happened if Edgar Schmued had stayed in Germany, if he had not emigrated to Brazil, then to America. If Dutch Kindleberger had not asked him that simple question in 1940, the Mustang would never have existed. The bombers would have continued to be slaughtered over Germany. The Luftwaffe might have remained a potent force. The war might have ended differently. But that is not what happened. Instead, a boy who watched his first airplane at age 8, who taught himself engineering because he could not afford university, who fled a shattered economy and rebuilt his life across 2 continents, created the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe. The plane that a German designed destroyed the German Air Force. History sometimes has a cruel sense of irony. Today, if you visit aviation museums around the world, you can stand next to a P-51 Mustang. You can see the carefully contoured wing that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic theory. You can see the distinctive belly scoop that turned cooling into thrust. You can see the bubble canopy that gave pilots unmatched visibility. You can touch the smooth aluminum skin that Schmued insisted be finished to the highest standards. More than 150 Mustangs remain airworthy today, nearly 80 years after production ended. They still fly at airshows. They still race at Reno. They still inspire new generations of aviation enthusiasts. They are living monuments to a quiet German immigrant who refused to let circumstances define his destiny. Edgar Schmued did not just design an airplane. He designed a legend. He proved that genius has no nationality, that determination can overcome any obstacle, that one person with the right skills and the right opportunity can change the course of history. He did it with no formal education. He did it after personal tragedy. He did it in 102 days, working 18-hour shifts, driven by a vision that others said was impossible. The next time you see a Mustang flying at an airshow, remember the man who created it. Remember the 8-year-old boy watching his first airplane. Remember the mechanic who taught himself aerodynamics. Remember the immigrant who crossed 2 oceans to follow his dreams. Remember Edgar Schmued, the German who built the plane that crushed the Luftwaffe. His story reminds us that greatness does not care where you were born or what degrees you hold. Greatness cares only about what you can create when you refuse to accept that anything is impossible. Do you think we would have won the air war without the Mustang? Let me know in the comments below. But let us return to the story because the technical details of what Schmued accomplished deserve deeper exploration. When he designed the Mustang in those frantic 102 days, he was not simply creating another fighter aircraft. He was solving problems that other engineers had deemed unsolvable. Consider the fuel situation. The British specification called for a fighter with exceptional range. The Spitfire, for all its legendary qualities, was essentially a short-range interceptor. It could barely fly 200 miles before it needed to return and refuel. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 had similar limitations. These were aircraft designed to defend home territory, not to project power deep into enemy airspace. Schmued designed the Mustang with internal fuel tanks that held 180 gallons, already more than the Spitfire. When they added the fuselage tank behind the pilot, capacity jumped to 269 gallons. With the 2 external drop tanks, the aircraft could carry over 400 gallons of fuel. The Mustang was 3 times more fuel efficient than the P-47 Thunderbolt, achieving more than 3 miles per gallon compared to the Thunderbolt's 2 miles per gallon. This efficiency came from the low-drag design that Schmued had insisted upon. North American's production team developed new manufacturing techniques to meet these demands. Every rivet was countersunk flush with the surface. Every panel joint was filled and smoothed. Factory workers applied a special filler compound to the leading edges of the wings to eliminate any waviness. Quality control was obsessive by the standards of the time. Did the laminar flow wing actually achieve true laminar flow in combat conditions? This has been debated by aerodynamicists for decades. In pristine wind tunnel conditions, the airfoil performed exactly as theory predicted. But in the real world, with bugs splattered on the leading edges, oil streaks from the engine, and the general grime of combat operations, true laminar flow was probably achieved only partially, if at all. But here is what matters. Even if the wing never achieved perfect laminar flow in service, its shape still provided benefits. The carefully contoured surfaces delayed compressibility effects at high speeds. The thin profile allowed the Mustang to dive faster than other fighters before encountering dangerous shock waves. At Mach 0.78, the Mustang could still maintain control. German fighters began experiencing control problems at Mach 0.75. That difference could mean life or death in a high-speed dive. The radiator installation was another stroke of genius. Most liquid-cooled fighters mounted their radiators in drag-inducing positions. The Spitfire had its radiator under the wing. The Bf-109 had a chin-mounted radiator that created significant drag. Schmued located the Mustang's radiator in a duct underneath the rear fuselage. This arrangement served multiple purposes. First, it kept the radiator away from the engine, which allowed a sleeker nose profile. Second, the duct was carefully designed to slow the incoming air before it passed through the radiator, improving cooling efficiency. Third, the heated air exiting the duct provided a small amount of thrust through what engineers call the Meredith effect. Some have claimed that the Meredith effect completely eliminated cooling drag at certain speeds and altitudes. This is probably an exaggeration, but the system was remarkably efficient for its time. Combined with the low-drag fuselage and wings, it made the Mustang approximately 30 to 40 miles per hour faster than the P-40, even though both aircraft used the same Allison engine in their early versions. The transformation brought by the Merlin engine conversion deserves special attention. The original Allison V1710 engine was a good power plant at low altitudes. It produced around 1,100 horsepower below 15,000 feet. But its single-stage supercharger simply could not compress enough air at higher altitudes to maintain power. By 20,000 feet, power had dropped significantly. By 25,000 feet, the Mustang was at a serious disadvantage against German fighters. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 series changed everything. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, designed by the brilliant engineer Stanley Hooker, maintained power at altitudes where the Allison gasped for air. The Merlin produced nearly 1,400 horsepower at 23,000 feet. It could maintain combat power up to 30,000 feet and beyond. The American Packard Company began manufacturing Merlins under license as the V1650 series. This was crucial because British Merlin production was fully committed to Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. Without American-built engines, the Merlin Mustang program would have remained a limited experiment rather than a war-winning production effort. Installing the Merlin required significant modifications to the Mustang airframe. The engine was slightly heavier and had different dimensions than the Allison. The two-stage supercharger required an intercooler, which Schmued's team mounted in the radiator duct. The new engine cowling had a distinctive chin intake to feed the supercharger. A 4-blade propeller replaced the original 3-blade unit to absorb the additional power. The combination of the Merlin engine and Schmued's airframe produced something extraordinary. At 29,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour in level flight. It could climb to 20,000 feet in just under 6 minutes, almost twice as fast as the Allison-powered version. And it still retained the incredible range that made the Mustang unique. The impact on the air war was immediate and devastating. Before the Merlin Mustangs arrived in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force was losing the battle for air superiority. The strategic bombing campaign was being questioned at the highest levels. Some commanders were ready to abandon daylight bombing entirely and switch to the British method of night area bombing. General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. He immediately recognized the Mustang's potential. But he also understood that simply escorting bombers was not enough. The Luftwaffe could refuse combat, preserving their strength for decisive moments. To truly defeat the German fighter force, Doolittle needed to destroy it. He issued a revolutionary order. Fighter pilots were no longer required to stay close to the bombers. Once the bombers reached their targets and turned for home, the fighters were freed to hunt. They could pursue German aircraft anywhere. They could attack airfields. They could strafe any target of opportunity. The Mustang pilots became predators rather than bodyguards. This tactical change multiplied the Mustang's effectiveness. German pilots could no longer simply avoid the escort fighters. Now the Americans came looking for them. Luftwaffe bases were attacked repeatedly. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Experienced pilots were killed during vulnerable takeoffs and landings. The attrition was relentless. The training system of the Luftwaffe could not keep pace. At the beginning of 1944, German fighter pilots entered combat with an average of over 200 hours of flight training. By the end of the year, this had dropped to barely 60 hours. Inexperienced pilots in excellent aircraft were being sent against experienced Americans in superb aircraft. The results were predictable. Consider the aerial victories claimed by Mustang pilots during the war. American P-51s destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft. 281 Mustang pilots became aces, with 5 or more confirmed victories. The kill ratio was approximately 11-1 in favor of the Mustang. These numbers represented not just individual skill, but the cumulative effect of superior equipment, tactics, and logistics. One legendary mission illustrates the Mustang's capabilities. On March 4, 1944, P-51s of the 4th Fighter Group escorted bombers to Berlin for the first time. The mission covered 1,100 miles round trip. The pilots were in their cockpits for over 5 hours. They fought German interceptors over the capital of the Reich, and they returned to England with fuel to spare. When Hermann Göring learned that American fighters were appearing over Berlin, he refused to believe the reports at first. He had been assured by his technical staff that no single engine fighter could have such range. He thought the pilots must be lost or that the aircraft must be captured, Messerschmitts being flown by Americans for propaganda purposes. When he finally accepted the truth, he knew the implications were catastrophic. The Mustang also excelled in ground attack missions, although this came at a cost. Liquid-cooled engines are vulnerable to ground fire. A single bullet through the coolant system could cause the engine to seize within minutes. Mustang pilots performing strafing runs accepted significantly higher risk than those flying escort missions. But the aircraft's speed, range, and .650 caliber machine guns made it an effective strike platform. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe had been so weakened that it posed minimal threat to the invasion beaches. German aircraft that tried to attack were quickly driven off or destroyed. This air superiority, achieved largely by the Mustang and its pilots, was essential to the success of D-Day. Without it, the invasion might have failed or cost immensely more lives. The Pacific Theater also benefited from the Mustang's range. In early 1945, P-51s began operating from the newly captured island of Iwo Jima. From there, they could escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan and back. These were grueling 7-hour missions over open ocean, with no possibility of rescue if an aircraft went down. The pilots who flew them demonstrated extraordinary courage and endurance. After the war ended, the Mustang continued to serve. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the F-51, as it was then designated, was the only American fighter with sufficient range to hit targets in Korea from bases in Japan. Jets like the F-80 were faster, but they lacked the range and loiter time needed for close air support. The Mustang returned to combat, this time fighting against North Korean and Chinese ground forces. The Korean War also saw the F-86 Sabre, another aircraft designed under Edgar Schmued's leadership, establish dominance over the Soviet-built MiG-15 in the epic air battles over MiG Alley. The Sabre used swept-wing technology that German engineers had pioneered, but Schmued's design brought it to practical perfection. Of the 40 American pilots who achieved ace status in Korea, 39 flew Sabres. Schmued's philosophy of design remained consistent throughout his career. He believed in simplicity. He believed in efficiency. He believed in designing for manufacturing, not just for performance. The F-5 Tiger, which he developed at Northrop, embodied these principles. It was smaller, lighter, and cheaper than other American fighters. Yet it was highly effective in combat and served with over 20 air forces for more than 50 years. The T-38 Talon trainer is perhaps Schmued's most enduring legacy in terms of continuous service. First flown in 1959, the T-38 has been training American pilots for over 60 years. Every Air Force pilot who has earned their wings in that period has flown the T-38. It remains in service as of 2025, with plans to continue operating for several more years. No other aircraft has served so long in the same training role. Think about what this means. Pilots who trained in the T-38 have gone on to fly F-15 Eagles, F-16 Vipers, F-22 Raptors, and F-35 Lightning IIs. They have flown the space shuttle. They have walked on the moon. And all of them started their high-performance jet training in an aircraft designed by the same man who created the P-51 Mustang. Schmued's influence stretches across generations of aviators. The 1944 Truman Senate War Investigating Committee called the Mustang the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. General Henry Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, said that the appearance of long-range Mustang escort fighters over Germany was one of the great miracles of the war. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the 8th Air Force, saw the Mustang production line and declared, "That is the plane I want." Edgar Schmued received numerous honors during his lifetime. He was inducted into the International Aerospace Hall of Fame. He received awards from aviation organizations around the world, but he remained modest about his achievements. He deflected praise to his colleagues. He emphasized that aircraft design was a team effort. His famous quote captures his attitude perfectly. "Any damned fool can criticize, but it takes a genius to design it in the first place." This wasn't a boasting. It was a statement of fact from a man who had spent his entire life turning impossible ideas into flying machines. When Schmued passed away in June 1985, he left behind a legacy that few engineers can match. The P-51 Mustang alone would have secured his place in aviation history. But the F-82 twin Mustang, the F-86 Sabre, and his contributions to the F-100 Super Sabre, F-5 Tiger, and T-38 Talon all bear his mark. Together, these aircraft represent over half a century of American air power. There is a curious myth that persists about Edgar Schmued, one that he always denied. Because the early Mustang looked somewhat similar to the Messerschmitt Bf-109, rumors spread that Schmued had once worked for Willy Messerschmitt in Germany. Some versions claimed that the Mustang was heavily influenced by the German fighter. Neither claim is true. Schmued never worked for Messerschmitt. The Mustang was an entirely original American design. The visual similarities were coincidental, the result of both designers solving similar aerodynamic problems. In fact, pilots on both sides sometimes confused the two aircraft in the chaos of combat. There were instances of American gunners firing at approaching Mustangs, thinking they were Bf-109s. The Germans made similar mistakes. Eventually, Allied aircraft received distinctive invasion stripes and other markings to reduce friendly fire incidents. Schmued did receive intelligence about German aircraft during the war. North American obtained a captured Bf-109 from the Spanish Civil War in 1939 and disassembled it for study. German aviation journals were available through neutral countries until America entered the war. But this was standard intelligence gathering, not design plagiarism. Every aircraft company studied its competitors' products. The Mustang was also sometimes confused with another myth, that it was based on the Curtiss XP-46. This claim arose because North American purchased wind tunnel data from Curtiss during the Mustang's development. However, the data arrived too late to influence the fundamental design, and the XP-46, which was never produced, bore little resemblance to the Mustang. Today, more than 150 Mustangs remain airworthy worldwide. They gather at airshows and fly in formation. They race at Reno at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. They remind us of a time when the world hung in the balance and the right aircraft could make the difference between victory and defeat. They remind us of Edgar Schmued, the self-taught German immigrant who watched his first airplane at age 8 and decided to dedicate his life to aviation. The man who learned engineering from books because he could not afford university. The man who crossed 2 oceans to follow his dreams. The man who lost his wife in a car accident and still refused to give up. The man who designed the most famous fighter of World War II in just over 100 days. His story proves that genius recognizes no borders. That determination can overcome any obstacle. That one person with vision, skill, and opportunity can shape the course of history. The boy from Hornbach, Germany, became the designer who crushed the Luftwaffe. And his aircraft, the Mustang, remains a symbol of American air power nearly 80 years after the last one rolled off the production line. The Mustang's influence extended far beyond World War II. Its success validated the concept of long-range escort fighters and changed how military planners thought about air power projection. The lessons learned from its design and production informed the development of jet fighters in the post-war era. Schmued himself carried these lessons forward into every aircraft he touched. There is something poetic about the fact that so many Mustangs still fly today. Unlike most warbirds, which are carefully preserved museum pieces, the Mustang remains a living aircraft. Owners fly them regularly. Mechanics maintain them using skills passed down through generations. Pilots still describe the same joy that combat veterans felt when they first climbed into the cockpit. When you see a Mustang flying overhead, listen to the growl of that Merlin engine. Watch the distinctive silhouette against the sky. Remember Edgar Schmued. Remember what one determined individual can accomplish when they refuse to accept that anything is impossible. That is his true legacy, not just the aircraft he designed, but the proof that greatness can come from anywhere, from anyone, if they have the courage to pursue their dreams no matter what obstacles stand in their way.